Hi there, and welcome to today's Gender and Policy Center webinar on women seeking refuge, designed and moderated by Aubrey Grant. Since the inception of the Schar School's Gender and Policy Center in the fall of 2017, Aubrey's played a pivotal role in the center's operations and very essence. As our doctoral graduate research assistant, Aubrey has mastered all manner of logistics in running a successful center and series of events, including during this transition to the webinar and online formats since the start of the pandemic. An emerging scholar in her own right, Aubrey has co-authored several articles on issues of gender in the policy context, including our forthcoming co-authored work in public integrity on race and gender in emergency management codes of ethics. Today's webinar reflects Aubrey's core area of scholarship in the area of refugee resettlement, which is the topic of her forthcoming dissertation. I'm pleased to welcome today's panelists to share their experience on the evolving status of the plight and policy of refugee resettlement as the US administration transitions, with a particular eye to outcomes for women. Before Aubrey begins the introductions and moderation of the panel, it's my honor to introduce Dean Mark Rozell, founding dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government, to welcome us. Mark?
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, I'm very pleased to welcome you today to yet another Schar School webinar, raising issues of policy import and social justice for discussion within and beyond the Mason community. Today's dialogue on women seeking refuge is sponsored by the Schar School's Gender and Policy Center, GAP, capping a series of 2020 events focused on gender in the policy context. This past summer, GAP hosted a webinar on domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. In August, GAP started the semester commemorating the centennial of women's suffrage by considering racial disparities in women's access to the vote. The panel featured keynote remarks from Virginia gubernatorial candidates, state legislators, Jennifer Carroll Foy and Jennifer McClellan. And in September, GAP collaborated with Academy Women to host two panels discussing unconscious bias in the workplace and in the public sphere, featuring the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James, and EEOC Commissioner, Vicki Lipnick. Most recently, authors Linda Robb and Rebecca Boggs Roberts participated in a book talk with GAP Director Bonnie Stabile on the Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World. Today's GAP's final webinar of the semester is dedicated to examining the recent past and future of US protection for refugee women. The discussion will be moderated by our own Schar School doctoral candidate, Aubrey Grant, who will now take it from here. Aubrey?
Thank you so much, Dean Rozell, and thank you all for being here today. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our next and our keynote speaker, Danielle Grigsby. Danielle is the Director of Policy and Practice for Refugee Council USA, which is a coalition of 29 US-based non-governmental organizations who represent a diverse group of nonprofits who advocate for and with refugees. Prior to working at RCUSA, Danielle served as a case manager for the International Rescue Committee in Salt Lake City, Utah. And prior to that, she was a project supervisor at the Resettlement Support Center, Africa in Kenya. Danielle had several years of experience working with organizations, providing services to refugees. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Aubrey. Thank you so much. And it's good to be here. And thanks for that introduction. So coming together today, now that we have the outcome of the most recent election and we are looking down the barrel of the transition toward January is so different than when Aubrey and I first started having a discussion around what this conversation might look like back in September, and not knowing the outcome of the election weighed quite heavily on how we would have this conversation. And there's a lot of reason for that. If you've lived in the United States or followed US politics at all over the last 4 years, it would be hard to miss some of the things that this outgoing administration had chosen to do to systemically threaten the systems of protection in the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those things and talk a little bit about how we understand the future to be, and give an eye towards especially vulnerable populations such as women and girls or folks who are LGBTQIA+. But before I do any of that, a little bit more about Refugee Council USA to give some context. So as Aubrey noted, we are the coalition in the United States that convenes the protectors of the systems of protection. So we have on our membership of 29 organizations, all 9 of the federally funded resettlement agencies who welcome refugees into the United States, and then other like-minded groups who participate in welcome and integration and mental health services for vulnerable populations who do seek refuge in the US, whether it is through the resettlement program or folks who are seeking asylum in the United States from our southern border or other ports of entry. We've been around for 20 years and through that time have responded to large expansions and some contractions of the program, the systems of protection themselves, but never have we seen such a deliberate and intentional attack on the US's systems of protection than we have for the last 4 years. And apropos this conversation, when a system that is designed to protect vulnerable people, while it has other aims, understandably, resettlement serves US foreign policy interests, it has a lot of different things that it means in different contexts, and we can acknowledge that and have side conversations about it. But at its fundamental core, the purpose of a resettlement program and/or an asylum system is to protect individuals who are vulnerable, who have under international standing to be recipients of protection. And when those systems are under attack and are threatened, it impacts all vulnerable people, but especially it impacts folks that we are discussing today, women and girls, people who are LGBTQIA, other groups who are specifically vulnerable in protracted situations of displacement. So this administration, right off the bat, they threw down a Muslim and refugee ban. We saw the arrivals of individuals who come from predominantly Muslim countries who have legitimate protection needs shrink by 93% from the start of the fiscal year 2017 till today. On top of that, we saw the presidential determination shrink from a historical average of around 95,000 individuals seeking refuge in the United States through the resettlement program in particular, not to mention our southern border, shrink down incrementally every year until this past year. And for FY21, the presidential determination was set as just 15,000 people. This is at the same time while the folks at the southern border are being forced to stay and remain in Mexico while their cases are ostensibly being processed. But in fact, all of these systems are being incrementally and intentionally whittled away such that individuals who would be eligible for resettlement are no longer eligible based on truly arbitrary extra vetting or re-understanding or reimagining of vulnerability criteria. So we just closed out a fiscal year, and for the past fiscal year, just for the resettlement program alone, we made a commitment to resettle 18,000 individuals, which is astronomically low. We were only able to bring in 11,000 of those folks. And this is at the time when the world is facing the most intense, protracted refugee situation and displacement situation that we have seen in modern history. So that kind of gets at why when Aubrey and I started having this conversation about what women and girls in protracted situations of displacement and their opportunities for protection, why this conversation when we first started having it in September was quite heavy. and that isn't to say that one political party in the United States is so excited and ready to uphold these systems and values of welcome. That's not to say that they're not, but we do have signals from this incoming administration that have very early on said that they would return the systems of protection to their purposeful functioning order. And so we have made, as a coalition, recommendations and suggestions and are working in partnership with this transition administration to remove the barriers that were intentionally put on systems of protection such that they can meet the needs of the most vulnerable people. And while RCUSA as a coalition understands vulnerability to be the UN definition of vulnerability, we do definitely recognize that there are certain groups of individuals within that construct who are especially in need of these protection mechanisms to function as they were designed to do so. So this is actually an exciting time, because not only will we be able to right now hold our incoming administration accountable to overturn some of these negative policies and work together in concert to rebuild this program, we can do so with an intention that looks towards some of these special populations to make sure that we meet those critically individualistic needs of populations once, not only to get to the United States, but once they arrive here. My colleagues are expert on some of those specifics, and so I'm going to wrap up now. Later on, I'll talk a little bit more about some of our specific asks for a new administration, but I'm just thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you with this positive look toward the future, and we'll just really enjoy working in collaboration to really see refugee arrivals and asylum restored. Thanks, Aubrey.
Thank you so much, Danny. You've given us a lot to talk about and present a very optimistic view as we move into 2021. So with that, I do want to introduce you to today's panelists.
Nora Bagirinka is the co-founder and program director for Refugee Women in Action, an organization dedicated to empowering and aiding women as they resettle and integrate into their new community. Nora is also the Ohio delegate for Refugee Congress and serves on the board of National Justice for Our Neighbors. Nora is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide and was granted asylum in the United States in 2005. Devon Cohn is the senior advocate for women and girls at Refugees International. Prior to joining Refugees International, Devon was the director of protection programs at HIAS, where she was responsible for providing technical expertise to HIAS's protection-related programming globally. Prior to HIAS, Devon worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Lebanon, Uganda, Egypt, and Kenya, and she also worked with a variety of other NGOs providing services to refugees. Dr. Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera is an associate professor here at the Schar School of Policy and Government. Her areas of expertise are Mexico-U.S. relations, organized crime, immigration, border security, social movements, and human trafficking. Her most recent book, released in April of this year, is entitled North American Borders in Comparative Perspective, and it compares immigration policies along the southern and northern U.S. borders. Dr. Gest is an associate professor of policy and government here at George Mason University's Schar School. He studies immigration and the politics of demographic change. He is author of 5 books, including Apart, Alienated and Engaged Muslims in the West, The New Minority, White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality, and Crossroads, Comparative Immigration Regimes in a World of Demographic Change. He also co-edits the Oxford University Press Book Series, Oxford Studies in Migration and Citizenship. I want to thank all the panelists for being here today.
And I want to start our discussion by just giving you time to make some opening remarks. So Dr. Gest, I think we'll start off with you.
Thanks so much, Aubrey, for this invitation. It's really great to be with everyone today. I think that what I can best add to this panel is a sense of the sort of landscape of immigration politics here in the United States and policymaking. And I think that perhaps one of the most surprising things I can tell everyone, and this will come as a surprise to many people who are not thinking about immigration on a day-to-day basis, is that there were in fact no significant acts of immigration legislation passed during the Trump administration. Certainly, immigration was a hallmark of the Trump administration. It was a hallmark of Trump's 2 campaigns. It's a hallmark of his rhetoric, of his political symbolism, but no really major acts of legislation, no acts at all really, were passed by the legislature. And all these changes that were made were done by executive authority, which generally means that they may be reversed by executive authority by future administrations. And so it's relatively easy to raise the refugee cap, which I expect that the Biden administration will do very quickly once they take office. It's very easy to end what is effectively a Muslim ban. And you are likely to see changes to asylum procedures and the management of deportation cases. You are likely to see the United States government sign on to the global compacts at the United Nations. These are all things that the US government can do with some ease. And so much of this is reversible. However, the damage has also been done by the Trump administration to a number of components of the US immigration system because many of those changes can actually be quite sticky. I think that overall, the stickiest of the changes is the credibility that has happened to the US, the damage to this credibility of the US immigration system. Requirements for citizenship have been altered. They're harder to change because they take longer to actually implement. There are enormous application and appeals backlogs in the US system. And as it relates to refugees, it's just not as easy as simply raising the cap. It's not a faucet that can simply be turned on and off. There is a pipeline of vulnerable individuals and families from other countries that must be processed. And that process takes time to restart. And on top of all that, of course, there's also an extensive infrastructure of resources that support the successful resettlement and integration of clients, the refugees and their families, in new American contexts. And all of that now needs to be rebuilt. So in terms of the politics of immigration, the same forces that prevented the Trump administration and nearly every other presidential administration from passing a major overhaul of the immigration system for the past 3 decades and longer have not really changed. And what's worse, of course, is that while there was not a lot of political pressure to enact that change, and while there was a lot of political pressure to enact that change under the Bush and Obama administrations, that sense of urgency has now shifted to other issues, which means that politicians, of course, may be less likely to spend precious political capital on an issue that is now lower on the American priority list. Of course, it's not going to be lower on the priority list of folks who are on this panel, but on the general American voters' priority list, that has changed. These days, the focus is on the coronavirus pandemic, healthcare provision, and the economic recovery. And the Biden administration seems to be searching for consensus building packages that cross the aisle. And unfortunately, that is not immigration, which is effectively radioactive and very, very polarizing. Even before the pandemic, immigration was the #1 political issue for about 1/5 or even 1/4 of all Americans. But those individuals for whom immigration was so important were almost exclusively Republicans and restrictionists. They wanted to stop all immigration. Among Democrats, the issue, even before the COVID struck, immigration didn't even crack the top 10 issues among most Democrats. And so in terms of saliency. And so while the Biden administration holds very strong positions on immigration, it is unlikely, I think, in my opinion, to do much more than pursue the reversal of Trump administration executive orders in the short run. But even that would be a source of great relief, a source of great opportunity, and a gesture to America's historic image as a nation of refuge and as a nation of immigrants. Now, of course, this also provides certain opportunities because in some ways, the Trump administration actions have created a bit of a blank slate now for the rebuilding of the refugee program's infrastructure, and perhaps improvements can be made to it that actually advance our ability to accept more people and do a better job resettling them. And I know that's going to be a subject that we discuss here on this panel.
Thank you so much, Justin. I think I'd like to turn now to Devon, who can kind of bring in the gendered implications of the last couple of years on, immigration policy and how it's impacted refugee women and girls.
Yeah, thanks, Aubrey, and thanks to Danny for her comments and Justin. This is a great panel. I'm grateful to the organizers. Aubrey, you've done so much for this. So like you said, today I want to speak about the gendered implications of forced displacement. And I'm going to, because Justin and Danny spoke so much about the US, I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. but I want to speak about these gendered implications of forced displacement more generally, especially during two very difficult time periods and periods which have overlapped. So the time of the Trump administration and the time of the pandemic. Both of those time periods and issues have really affected displaced women and girls. But because Danny and Justin both spoke to how the Trump administration and the rise of populism and nationalism in both the US and other parts of the world have dramatically and detrimentally affected prospects for people seeking international protection, I'm not going to speak too much about that because they already did, but there's certainly a long list, as Justin mentioned, of policies, maybe not legislation, but executive policies that the Trump administration has put in place that directly harms displaced women and girls and their ability to access protection. So instead of focusing on that stuff, I'm going to focus on the unique and disproportionate challenges that displaced women face and why they need this protection. So while there's a lot to say about the US, many of these challenges are so widespread and they span many different countries and environments, which is what I do for my job, is look at things globally. So what I want to focus on is two of the main challenges that displaced women and girls disproportionately face everywhere. And those are, number one, a rise in gender-based violence, and two, a lack of economic sustainability. So the risk that women and girls have of experiencing gender-based violence dramatically increases in displacement and in emergencies. When persecution, war, or climate-related disasters force women to leave home, the risk of gender-based violence always increases. That's important to note and remember, is that it always increases. We don't always know the numbers exactly or get accurate reporting, but those risks always increase. Because displacement disrupts the social support systems of women and girls, and it leaves them increasingly vulnerable to exploitation with limited options for legal recourse, because often they've crossed international borders or they don't have options for legal recourse for the gender-based violence that they experience. And this gender-based violence comes in many forms: intimate partner violence or domestic violence, conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, forced and early marriage. There's dozens of ways that women and girls in displacement are at risk of gender-based violence. So in the course of my work over the years, one of the most distressing issues I've encountered is when I meet women and girls who have fled horrific violence, and yet they feel even less safe in the place where they have fled to than the place where they have fled from. So on top of that, gender-based violence as a whole, not just among displaced women, has dramatically increased during the pandemic. So I think that's really telling to say that many women and girls feel very unsafe in countries that they already have refugee status in, which is again why resettlement is such an important program in the US and elsewhere. The second issue for displaced people that definitely has gendered implications is economic sustainability and labor market access. So forcefully displaced people, whether they are within their own countries or they have crossed international borders and are asylum seekers or refugees, are often displaced for long periods of time. Danny mentioned protracted refugee situations, people that are in these situations for decades upon decades. And they also have limited humanitarian support. So that means that inevitably displaced people need to figure out ways to economically sustain themselves. Yet many countries don't allow refugees and asylum seekers access to the formal labor market. And for displaced women, there can be even more barriers, such as a lack of education, caregiving responsibilities that they have, the risk of exploitation when going to a job or coming from a job, cultural taboos against working outside of the home. Whatever that may be, there's additional barriers for displaced women. And at least 25% of refugees are part of a female-headed household, which means that for their family's survival, it is absolutely essential that they be able to earn wages. So a female-headed household, meaning that you've got a single mother, for example, with children, or a female running the household. So, of course, as it has with all economies around the world, this pandemic has made the prospect of having a job, which is already difficult for displaced people, and especially difficult for displaced women, even more challenging. So these are two of the reasons, I think, why immigration policies and resettlement and protection, the access to international protection in the US and elsewhere is really vital and key. And I think, again, as Danny and Justin have already stated, this last period of the last 4 years has been really, really detrimental to the overall international protection system, to the credibility of the US, to our leadership capabilities on this front, and really to women and girls specifically that are in these situations of persecution, forced displacement, unsustainable living situations in protracted refugee situations. And so I think, there's a lot of hope of how we can change things. I was saying to Aubrey, I'm writing something right now about what the Biden administration can do. So I think I'll address that in the question and answer period. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage for why women and girls need special and particular protections and really need access to these really effective programs that need to be rebuilt, but need to be rebuilt in an even better, more sustainable way. So I'll leave it there, and I'll address more in the questions.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I now want to move to Guadalupe, who can provide some remarks about Central American migration to the U.S. and as it relates to women and girls.
Thank you, Aubrey. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Bonnie, and the Gender and Politics Center at George Mason University for this invitation and for this excellent conversation with great experts. I'm going to talk about the tragedy, the human tragedy of the policies, not only in these past 4 years, but policies that have been implemented that have put people, especially women and girls, at great risk along the migration routes and right now on the Mexican side of the border, with the migration protection protocols, metering, and the current situation that's combined right now, not only at the policy level. I'm going to talk about the human tragedy. I started doing research on the ground with undocumented immigrants from Central America and along Mexico's migration routes. But in 2019, we started to figure out that people from other countries were looking for refuge in the United States without having access to that, coming from different countries. The exodus from Venezuela, because of the very complicated situation, has become a very big humanitarian crisis. And they have been able to go to Colombia, but right now they're experiencing many problems in Colombia and they are moving north. At the same time, I started to observe that people started to take the same routes as Central American migrants from different countries. And I'm going to talk about women and girls, but I'm right now talking about the general issue. Coming from many countries from the African continent and Southeast Asia. At the same time, with the end of the dry foot, wet foot policy, because of the regularization for a very short time of relationships with Cuba, we have seen hundreds of Cuban immigrants right now stuck at the border and trying to make a living in Mexico or in other countries of the southern cone of this hemisphere. In this situation, many actors have taken advantage of people at risk that have been displaced from their countries of origin. And I'm talking about human smugglers that have been in connection with other criminal groups, such as human trafficking, sex trafficking rings, and even criminal organizations, such as Mexican drug cartels. As a matter of fact, women and girls are the ones that are put at risk, particularly being involved in sex trafficking rings or being forced to work for very little. We cannot say that this is kind of labor trafficking, but labor exploitation is a norm right now. And right now, because of migration protection protocols, they are not going back to their countries. They cannot go back to the African continent of Southeast Asia. They have to stay in Mexico. And this is going to be, and it is, a very big tragedy. Since 2014, with the crisis of unaccompanied minors, we started seeing these massive flows of people, and it's going to be difficult that this situation will be solved completely. We can talk in Washington about policies to move back to what we had before. But what we had before still was a crisis. 2014 showed us a humanitarian crisis and opened us the eyes to what was happening. But since I started to live in Brownsville and started to do this research along the migration routes, we saw the bees, people moving along on trains. And right now, I'm seeing people from everywhere in the world trying to make it to safe places and just finding drug cartels, violence, and violence of all types. And women and girls are put in very, very complicated situations at the border, with the sex trafficking rings. And this is not going to change very fast, because during the time that these executive orders are going to be reversed, it's going to take time. And how many of these people are really going to make it to the places that they believe are safe? This is a question that we have to understand. And we have to understand that more countries have to sit on the table and see what can be happening. We're talking about policies that just a matter of the United States. And still today, we have a very divided society in the United States, and the reversal of the policies is not going to be so easy. And in the meantime, the exploitation of women and girls in Mexico, in Panama, all along these routes. I mean, I have talked to, for example, Cuban migrants that are right now working in different spaces in the city of Ciudad Juarez. Some women are involved in sex work, some women are working in restaurants, but at the same time, this is a very, very dangerous city. How long is it going to take for these people to find a place in Mexico, in the United States, or somewhere? So I am quite worried, because I see future, I see hope in the next few years, but I don't know if it's going to be enough to protect all the people that are at risk, particularly women and girls, because as we know, they are at much greater risk. When they travel along the routes, they have to take contraceptives, they are raped, they are murdered easier than anybody else. And I'm very worried about sex trafficking rings that are operating since all these century, but it's becoming much more well organized. We can talk about that later on in another occasion, but it's a very complicated journey, a very, very dangerous journey for women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Correa-Cabrera. Now I'd like to move on to Nora, who can kind of provide us a little bit of the local context of experiences that women encounter as they are resettling into new and local communities, and especially those women she works with in Ohio. Hi, Nora.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's really exciting whenever I share my personal experience or share what I'm doing. I came here in 2004 and then got my asylum in 2005. I come from Rwanda, where there was a genocide in 1994, and I just summarize about my story. I came to work here. I was working on a documentary that was about the women, what they were facing after the genocide. So I happened to meet the journalists, and I was invited to come here and travel with them and share as well my own experience. So when I shared my experience, and the documentary got nominated for Oscars in 2006 and then got Emmys Award in 2008. So this gave me a platform and gave me a picture to come and serve other people. Because when I came to Columbus, I found there were 2 resettlement agencies that were serving refugees. My church really helped me a lot, the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Columbus. But when I wanted some more extra help, when I went to resettlement agencies, I found that they're mostly focusing on refugees. And here I was a Salih. So I tried to figure things on my own. And eventually I started imagining what happens to other women who can't even speak the language, who doesn't have what I have, because I could see myself more luckier, because at least I could communicate. Had some education, but I imagine what about other women who could not even voice up. So I asked my church to help me start the nonprofit. It was before called Refugee Women in Action, and then afterwards we changed to it was before Rwanda Refugee Women in Action, and then later on became Refugee Women in Action, because we do help and serve other women from other parts of the world. So we started the Refugee Women in Action afterwards in order to serve other women from different parts of the world. We are small. Mostly I work with the volunteers and the students from Ohio State. Our work, we don't have much resource, we don't have much money, but we provide, we connect the refugee women or their families to resources, whereby I realized that the 90 days window whereby you're supposed to learn English and figure out their life was very short. So I started helping that way, connect them, even interpreting or just helping with homework or helping with ESL classes at home. This has been very helpful and supportive to families because I started this. The reason I started this was because where I was coming from. After the genocide, I found myself alone. My family had gone, and I remained with the 3 boys and a wounded mother. My ex-husband was in jail, and he was in jail for 13 years. He left me with nothing. Even his family were not supportive. I didn't have anything that entitled to me, even clothes. So I started just going to other women who supported me. And I vowed that if I ever get a chance, I would help other people. So when I came to Ohio, I was able to help. I came not intentionally to stay because I had so many challenges back home. I had the 3 boys to take care of and my mother and the husband in jail. But I came through some organization and the journalists who helped me. They asked me if I was interested in applying for asylum, and I did. I got it. I was so grateful because on my own I wouldn't do it. So that's why I was compelled to help other women. We provide uh, day-to-day help. It's like a it's 911 line for the community. Sometimes they call us in the middle of the night. Someone says, I'm stuck at the hospital and I don't know how to call my tax back home, or I want to go to the hospital, I don't know how to call 911. So I intervene with other volunteers a lot of time, and these hours are going on. You work 24 hours and there's no pay. It's volunteerism, but I feel it's rewarding to me. It's really rewarding because I've encouraged women to go back to school. I've encouraged women to take some ESL classes. But again, the challenge is that most of when you are a single mother or a single woman, the support is limited. For instance, when I came, I was educated. I had a bachelor's degree. I could speak English, but still I faced some challenges, because the challenges I faced, like even learning how to drive in America. So I didn't have enough money to pay for driving school, but then I would rely on my neighbors, whom I thought maybe they would understand me better. They were immigrants, and most of the time it was men. Most of them, they wanted to take advantage of me. Some would charge me a lot of money just for like 20 minutes learning, and then others who were demanding sexual incentives, which I couldn't give. It was so hard, and then that's why it really mostly compelled me. So let me go on and try to help. It's been a long journey, but I know that a lot of women still faces the same challenges because of lack of education, language barriers, and mostly what we see is the 90 days window whereby the women or the families, they're forced to go to work when they're not ready, especially when they don't have the language, they can't read and write. So they get the odd jobs, they get the warehouse jobs, which are temporary. And when they're done, it's very hard to come back into the system and even apply for food stamp, or if for those who could even apply for unemployment. It's very hard. But what we have done in my community, we teamed up with some other women just to volunteer and check up on the families and see if we can help. But thank you very much. I hope I have not taken much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you for sharing your story with us and for addressing some of the challenges that refugee women face as they resettle. I now want to move into some questions for our panelists. I want to bring Danny back in so she can answer some of the questions as well. As a quick programming note, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A feature. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so we're going to try to get through as many as possible. But I want to go ahead and throw out the first question, actually to Danny, and it comes from an audience member who asked if there's an economic benefit to the U.S. for receiving immigrants or refugees from other countries. And if so, what are those benefits from encouraging immigration or refugee resettlement?
Thanks, Aubrey. And I would offer folks a report that the New American Economy published a few years ago that took a look at the economic contributions of refugees in the United States and showed that while refugees do receive benefits upon arrival, that very quickly after arrival, the jobs and economic contributions of refugees far out exceed the benefits that they received in their initial integration period, and that their entrepreneurship rate far exceeds even domestically born individuals in the United States. So there's a lot of data there. I'm going to drop that in the chat, but it's pretty significant contributions that refugees make to the United States upon arrival.
Thank you so much, Danny. And I think now I want to jump into some kind of questions about the Biden administration and what we can look forward to seeing in 2021. And I want to first turn to Justin, who's written a book on Crossroads Comparative Immigration Regimes in a World of Demographic Change. And in this book, he and his co-author identified different types of immigration policy apparatuses. The US has been labeled through this humanitarian regime. And as we heard both Justin and Danny talk about, and actually all our panelists talk about, this kind of humanitarian focus where there's increased rates of humanitarian and family reunification visas has really been dismantled by the Trump administration. And so I think, Justin, I want to first ask you, are we likely to see strengthening of policies moving forward? I know you spoke about kind of the 400 executive actions that the president has taken that has led to restricting access for immigrants. So in a Biden administration, are we likely to see policies that are strengthened within these humanitarian kind of visa programs?
It's a great question, Aubrey. The data that we used in my book with Anna Boucher, Crossroads, predated the Trump administration. And so certainly during the Trump administration, it's hard to call the immigration regime humanitarian. But in fact, actually, the fundamentals of the American policy design that made it humanitarian before the Trump administration were still very much there during the Trump administration. Certainly, to be sure, the refugee number sank to the lowest levels really in almost a century. But the fundamentals of our immigration policy stood firm, and that is that we had an enormous share of our immigration admissions was driven by family reunification visas. And that is unlike any other country in the world, and it's not even close. About 65% of American entry visas on permanent visas are driven by family reunification purposes. And the next closest country is around half that. So those fundamentals have gone unchanged precisely for the reasons I mentioned earlier. We haven't passed major immigration overhauls. And so the Biden administration will inherit that same immigration system and will likely, as I mentioned earlier, raise the cap. And so in many ways, US immigration policy is stuck in a sort of policy formaldehyde from the 1980s, even back to the 1960s. And it's unlikely to change without congressional action. Basically, executive authority is just sort of nibbling around the edges, but with very great effects. It affects the lives of families. It affects the lives of immigrants and their neighbors, their employers. It has great effects, but in terms of the overall system, it's unlikely to change without major legislation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that moves us on into the next point, but I really want to ask Danny, as RCUSA has prepared, recommendations for the Biden administration, the president-elect Biden. What are the major kind of recommendations RCUSA has to move policy and practices into 2021?
Thanks, Aubrey. And borrowing a page from what Justin just so nicely teed up, since the Trump administration used executive authority so exclusively to very intentionally dismantle the operational working of protection systems in the United States, our recommendations to an incoming administration are to do the same in overturning those executive actions. But we recognize that that is time specific and sensitive to the immediate term. We need to turn the systems back on so that they function as they were designed to function, despite being a jalopy from the 1980s, so that we can meet these critical needs of the most vulnerable people in the United States. And at the same time, so just some example recommendations. We need the presidential determination to be reset from 15,000 to a number that is in line with historic norms. We need those executive orders to be overturned. We need better coordination in the White House between the different government bodies that oversee the resettlement program, just for example. But deeper into those recommendations, as we move beyond the first 100 days, points that Nora made, we have such collective knowledge now gained from experiential experts has come to the United States, and we need to be engaging in a co-design process to understand what works very well about the programs that we have in the US and what can be improved upon. We need to be listening and learning from individuals like Nora and the work that she's doing and seeing how that we can amplify that up to the national level. And at the same time, we need to borrow from some of Justin's research and be working with, we do still have large bipartisan support for appropriations of the resettlement program and asylum services, right? So we need to be working with our congressional allies to look at not just enhancing the resettlement program as it is, but looking toward a future where we have alternative pathways to protection in the United States that build upon the systems that were built in the 1980s and do so in such a way that we won't be as vulnerable to political will as we were under this administration. It really exposed some of the limitations and vulnerabilities of this program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny. And I look forward to seeing some of that in the next couple of years with the new administration. So Devon, I want to move to you. You mentioned, some of the issues and challenges that women face. I'm wondering, as we move into the next administration, what can President-elect Biden and his team do generally for women and specifically regarding IPV?
Thanks, Aubrey. I mean, there's a lot that the new administration can do, and a lot that they've actually already committed to in more vague terms in some ways, because they've been campaign commitments, but those campaign commitments need to translate into action, and there's a lot of ways that they can do that. I will say that I appreciate what Justin and Danny have been saying about resettlement, and again, that's very important. And I used to do resettlement cases, so I'm a huge proponent of resettlement, but resettlement and even seeking asylum in the US is still going to only be affecting a small portion of refugees and displaced people. We have almost 80 million displaced people around the world. And so again, the US has, a responsibility to allow people to access asylum and also provide them protection through these different complementary pathways and through resettlement. But the US also has incredible leverage and influence on how women and girls that are displaced overseas and in other places, how their lives are, what kind of access they have to healthcare, what kind of access they have to programming that can help prevent or respond to gender-based violence. And so, as you mentioned, intimate partner violence, that has really been the surge in the pandemic, both for women and girls generally in Brazil and the UK and the US and Japan, everywhere. But particularly amongst displaced women and girls, again, when they are already at risk of exploitation and gender-based violence, that those levels of intimate partner violence have really increased amongst them as well. And not only increased, but also the services that are there and usually there to help give them assistance are either no longer operating or are dismantled or are disrupted due to the pandemic. So those are all the challenges. But what the Biden administration can do is put in place the commitments that they've made in the campaign, but also include displaced women and girls, because oftentimes that's what the kind of gap is that there's a lot of initiatives for addressing gender-based violence globally, including legislation that's been introduced that has not been passed yet. So that needs to be reintroduced and passed through legislative action. But, the US has such influence, both in terms of the funding that we have and in terms of our leadership on these issues, that the Biden administration can put in place the campaign commitments they've made to addressing gender-based violence globally, and then remember to include displaced women and girls. Remember to incentivize governments to include displaced women and girls in their healthcare regimes, in their social safety nets, and all of these things. And then finally, one of the biggest things that I expect and am excited about and think is incredibly important for all women and girls, but especially displaced women and girls who are at risk, is that the Biden administration needs to re-include sexual and reproductive health services as a key right and a key programmatic services that we provide, because right now in the Trump administration, it's very hard. You know, there's policies that have been put into effect for not funding the UN agency that deals with reproductive health services and maternal health care, to not funding organizations and prohibiting funding from going to organizations that provide any of these services or provide a whole wide range of, you know, healthcare services for women and girls that are consistent. They're consistent needs, whether we're in a pandemic, whether we're not in a pandemic, and certainly when gender-based violence is at the levels that it's at right now. So those are a couple of things that the Biden administration can do, but they've already signaled that they will do some of that. It's just a matter of putting it into practice and specifying how to do so.
Thank you so much. And I think one of the areas the Biden administration will have to deal with is this migrant protection protocols that the Trump administration set up, which has forced women in makeshift camps along the southern border. And Guadalupe, you spoke a little bit about this, but can you talk more about the human trafficking and migrant smuggling that's been a result of the MPP and you know what we've seen from Central American women on the border?
Yeah, the issues that we are not just now seeing people, I mean, women from Central America, but women from many other countries at the border. And it's not that during these 4 years, human trafficking rings started to, you know, settle. They were already settled, but they have been expanded. There's more people. There is, you know, more material for them at the way that they look at women and girls to exploit them and to use them as their slaves in many ways. I am concerned that this is going to be expanded a little bit. I mean, not a little bit more, but much more, because as Devon explained, very few people are going to be resettled in the United States compared to the women and girls and to the people who are seeking for refuge in the United States. The problem is that Latin America, particularly during COVID-19 times, is experiencing a very big economic crisis. And if MPP is reversed very quickly, migrant smugglers are going to, of course, understand this is a time to give a signal, and this is the time to tell them that this is time to go. So maybe more people are going to, and consider the hurricanes, Iota and Eta, that have devastated several important cities and places in Central America right now. I'm thinking about Nicaragua, I'm thinking about Honduras and Guatemala, and people are desperate. So it's going to be very, very difficult. And also the United States might not, it's not going to be, you know, a new administration. There's going to be no wall. The wall is still there and I want to continue being there for many people. And we have to think about that. And I mean, what I was talking when I was explaining about these, nets of human smugglers connected with criminal organizations, connected with human trafficking rings. They just work in their own spaces. They collaborate and they put migrants at risk because some of them have been deported or are waiting for their cases to be heard in Mexico. This is not going to change. And they will be willing to participate in criminal activities, both men and women. And also they will have to maybe use their bodies to continue surviving. And this is very visible at the border and the border cities where you have all these actors acting because they are aware that people are waiting exactly there. It's easier for them. They have already crossed sometimes, the whole hemisphere. I have talked to people who have come from Chile, people from Cuba who have tried to make it in Chile and they haven't been able to work there, and they moved north with the money from their families in Miami, for example, and they are stuck in some places, and all these criminal actors that benefit from the exploitation of their labor or their bodies, or just what the activities that they already do, or the extortion also, because in order for them to cross, sometimes the groups that control territories ask for fees. So there is exploitation at many levels, not just human trafficking, but also all this extortion and the extraction of rents that these groups right now, with the diversification of activities, I'm talking about Mexican cartels or Mexican criminal organizations that are participating along the routes, and particularly on the Mexican side of the US border. Doctors Without Borders have, and many other organizations, WOLA, and many other NGOs that focus their efforts on human rights, have reported all this exploitation and all the tragic events that happen to them. They even lose their lives if they don't participate with these groups.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask all the panelists to stay on for just a couple minutes longer so we can ask Nora one last question. And so Nora, we've heard a lot from everybody on the panel today, including yourself, about the challenges that migrants face, and in particular women and girls. And I'm wondering, what is one change that we can make that will help women as they are resettled in the United States?
Okay, I think one change would be training the women. Even if they don't know how to read and write, train, give them more resources and support, because we have a culture in our language saying that when you train a woman, you train the nation. Please train, and provide resources.
Thank you so much. That was brief. I do want to say everybody here has made some very important points, and I would love to continue the conversation. But unfortunately, we don't have the time today. However, Dr. Justin Gest will be hosting this Friday a panel that's going to discuss more generally immigration policy. And so I hope you all can join him for his Power Lunch series. You can go find out more about it on the schar.gmu.edu under events, or you can tune in Friday at noon to the Schar School's YouTube page. And I want to thank all the panelists and everybody for being here today. To learn more about the Gender and Policy Center, please visit us on the web. We will also be, this video was recorded, and we will be providing it on our website and on the Schar School's YouTube page. So please look back in the next couple of days for that. And thank you to all the panelists for being here, and thank you to all the attendees for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Aubrey. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Joseph, and everybody. Thank you.